Welcome to this episode of Unraveling Adoption, an intentional space to delve into adoption's complexities together. I'm Beth Syverson. I'm an adoptive mom of a courageous and intuitive 20-year-old son, Joey. I'm walking beside him while working on my own personal growth and healing. I'm also a certified coach, primarily helping adoptive parents. Joey and I are committed to helping anyone impacted by adoption, and we want to help the general public understand adoption's complexities better too. I'm sure you're aware of the move toward more open adoptions in the past couple of decades. Though the definition and lived experience of open adoption can be drastically different from family to family, today we are going to talk to one family who has had open adoptions with their two adopted children from day one. We have with us today Linda Sexton, an adoptive mom and author of The Branches We Cherish, an open adoption memoir. And I'm happy to bring in her 25-year-old daughter, Belle. This is the first time we've had a mother-daughter team on Unraveling Adoption. And also, it's the first adoptive parent-adopted child duo besides me and my son on the pod. Awesome. So yay! I'm excited for these collaborations. So let's see where this conversation takes us. So welcome to Unraveling Adoption to Belle and Linda. Glad you're here.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Beth. Thank you for having us.
Well, I usually have adoptees just briefly share their adoption story at the beginning, just so we can kind of figure out where you're coming from. Belle, would you like to just tell us a little bit about your childhood, your adoption story?
For sure. So I was born in Austin, Texas. My birth parents were 15 and 16 when I was born. You can imagine that. And they considered a lot of different options when they first found out that they were pregnant, but adoption and open adoption resonated the most for them. So they made an open adoption plan, met my parents. They interviewed a lot of different parents, and they met my parents, and it just clicked. And so I only lived in Texas for about a year, and then we moved to Northern Virginia, and I had visits throughout my childhood with my birth mother and birth father. And I can kind of get into some of the details of that a little bit later, but I was very blessed in that I always knew who they were to me. And there's honestly not a time in my life that I can remember not knowing I was adopted.
Okay. Yeah, that's how I did it with my son too. And I think that's what we're supposed to be doing nowadays. That way they don't have a day where they're like, oh my gosh, what? And so you've been in touch with your birth family. Were you with your birth family for a year, or you stayed in Austin with your adoptive family for a year?
No. So I was with my parents, my mom, who's on right now, Linda, and David from, 2 days after I was born?
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. So they had made the plan beforehand and were a part of the pregnancy as well. And seeing me grow in my birth mother's belly and all that cool stuff.
Oh, okay. And just that little bit of conversation elucidated some interesting vocabulary issues because, like, who do you call what? Who are your parents?
Yeah. So I say mom and dad for my adoptive mom and my adoptive dad. And then I say birth mother and birth father for my birth parents. I think one thing that really stood out to me when I was younger, when I would very candidly share my adoption story, because that was just how my parents brought me up, is to be proud of such a cool background. But one of the questions I would get a lot are like, do you know your real parents, or what about your real parents? And that was always kind of triggering for me. I didn't like that. Like, my real parents are the ones who are raising me. So
yeah, that are taking you to ballet class or whatever you're doing. Yeah, doing the day-to-day stuff. So you call them your birth parents. I know some adoptees call them by your first name, or I don't know. Every family, I guess, has to make up how they want to do it. So that's really great. So Linda, how was that, watching this pregnancy and hoping that this child would become yours? How did that work for you? What was that like?
Yes, thank you, Beth. Very joyful and stressful time. All these emotions at the same time. And we did have the privilege of meeting and knowing and matching with Belle's birth parents. And I want to say we had about 3 months together. Now, we lived in different cities. I was in Houston and they were in Austin, but a 3-hour drive. So during that time, we did get together on multiple occasions and met their families as well, because they were teenagers, as Belle already said. So her birth mom was 15 and birth dad was 16. And so we did get a chance to meet their moms and dads too.
Oh.
And it was a really wonderful time for us to bond together. But it was a scary time for us and a scary time for them. And of course, it's one of those things that you never know what is going to happen after the child is born and how difficult it really can be, and as it should be for the birth parents.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So it was very, very stressful.
I bet.
And you had a little one too at that time. My older sibling was, as you mentioned, Beth, also the wonderful product of an open adoption.
Okay. So you were the second adopted child.
Yeah. So there was a little 4-year-old coming to all the meetings, right?
That's right.
Oh, wow.
That's right.
And having to explain all that to the 4-year-old.
Yeah, I just have to add this, that the 4-year-old, when they met the 4-year-old, that was one of the reasons why they ended up picking us, because they wanted a sibling for their child.
Oh, nice.
And they loved Belle's sibling. And they said, that's the family for us. It's just really heartwarming.
That is. Oh, that's beautiful. And Linda, I bet a part of you was like, oh no, what if this birth mom changes her mind? Because that can happen. And like, how did you handle all of those emotions happening?
Yes. That, of course, is a really big concern for the adoptive parents. But also, you know that if the birth mom and birth dad choose to make the adoption plan, that is not only their right, but it's something that if they want to do that at the end of the day, that's probably the right answer for that child. And I will say that actually did happen to us, that we were matched and the birth mom did decide to parent. And it was difficult, but at the end of the day, we knew that was the right thing. In the case of Belle, though, I will say birth mom and dad did, right after the birth, they took Belle into their room and they stayed there for 2 days. And David and I did not see them.
Wow.
And they needed those 2 days with Belle to bond with Belle and to make their final decision. And I know that those were probably the 2 most difficult days of their life. Mm-hmm. But when they did make that decision, they actually did a little ceremony in the chapel at the hospital.
Oh.
And Belle's birth mom handed Belle to me. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I'm going to cry.
It's going to make me cry too.
But Belle's birth mom handed Belle to me. Aww. And everybody was there and they all hugged and kissed. And it was the single deepest emotional single event that I ever experienced.
I bet. It sounds like it went as well as it could possibly go when someone has to relinquish a child. Mm-hmm. It sounds like there was a lot of care involved, a lot of intention, ritual, space, time to give to everyone involved. Are there pictures of that event or the ceremony or the...
No, we did not take pictures of the ceremony, which was the right thing. I mean, this was not the kind of event where you wanted cameras going. Yeah. But we certainly have wonderful pictures of Belle with them in the hospital room.
And I will say I was actually visiting my birth father and his kiddos, so my half siblings who I adore. I adore all of my half siblings. I have 8, so there's a lot. But 2 from my birth father. And the last time I was visiting their home, he actually brought out a big box of kind of memorabilia and stuff. He showed me pictures from like when my birth mother and him were dating, when they were like in high school together. And he also would write a lot. And so he had a lot of poetry and writing letters to me. And so that was really amazing. And also to be able to look through that box with my little half siblings as well, because they're kind of at the age where they're still wrapping their heads around how I am related to them, how I can have different parents, but still be their sister. But I will say kids are very resilient. Usually if you tell them something, they believe you and they take it at face value, which is wonderful. And it was a super cool moment to be able to share that and for them to be a part of it as well.
Oh, it just sounds so beautiful. I mean, this is kind of the story that I think the public thinks all adoptions are like.
Yeah.
I don't know. Because I've heard some really horrible exchanges, some really ripping babies away from birth,
my gosh.
Really, really tough situations. And I mean, if this is what the world thinks is adoption, well, this is pretty beautiful. I mean, a 15 and 16-year-old, that's really young, and you are able to stay in contact with them. So I'm sure it wasn't always perfect, though. Are you, without giving anyone else's story or, divulging too much personal stuff, what have been a few bumps in the road for any of you?
That's a good question.
Or maybe it has been perfect. I don't know.
No, I think it's a really good point to talk about. One of the things I think that's interesting in my case is I would say that I have a closer relationship with my birth father than I do my birth mother. She has 6 little ones of her own, well, all different ages. So she's got a big family, which obviously adds to maintaining a relationship.
Yeah.
But I think that was maybe sometimes growing up a little bit hard for me to understand. And I think that, like we were saying, my birth mother was 15 when I was born. So she was so young. And when I was turning 15 and thinking about that and just imagining like all of the turmoil that she went through, I think that was very challenging for her. And honestly, I would love to talk to her more about it. I haven't really gotten that opportunity just yet. And I also maybe haven't made that opportunity for myself just yet. But I can imagine that it was very difficult for her. But I will say one of the things that I did learn, which was actually a big comfort to me, but I know was hard for her to share, is that they did consider terminating the pregnancy as well. And I know that my birth mother was really worried that I would hear that and be distressed by it or sad or whatever. And honestly, it gave me so much comfort knowing that they had that option, especially being in Texas, knowing that they had that ability and they made the choice to have an adoption and it wasn't out of there being no other options.
You weren't forced to be there. They went through the pregnancy knowing that they would probably relinquish. And that felt kind of like you were meant to be here. Like there was some sacrifice on their part to meet this beautiful little baby and hand it to somebody else.
Exactly. My sibling and I have both talked about this, how we don't like when people use adoption as like, oh, well, like you don't need to terminate the pregnancy. You can just adopt, as if that's like such an easy thing to do, as if being 15 years old and making a plan for your child and relinquishing a child that you carried in your stomach for 9 months when you already have, all the hormones and struggles of being a 15-year-old. It's not an easy decision. And it was very courageous, but it's not always the right one for everyone.
Yeah, I'm with you. I don't think those two are on opposite ends of the spectrum. I think it's not like a choice between A or B. It's like they're totally different situations and much care needs to be taken all around. And Belle, did you grow up with this extended family in your birth family? Do you have memories with grandparents and that kind of thing on your birth side?
Yeah, definitely. I would get the most thoughtful gifts from my birth grandmother, my birth father's mom, for every birthday. Like it would be a quilt and everyone would have written a quote that they wanted me to have, or I got cowboy boots on my 16th birthday since I'm a Texan at heart. And I got a wonderful car organizer with all these different things for when I was starting driving. And they made me a CD. My birth parents both had big families and siblings. And so my birth father and all of his siblings and their parents picked a song and made this awesome mixtape for me for my 16th birthday. And I had many other really thoughtful gifts like that. And I was able to celebrate with them. And in fact, I'm going to spend Thanksgiving with them this year, which will be really fun. So I feel very lucky in that way. But I know you did kind of ask about the challenges, and I don't want to like gloss over what my sibling and I have gone through as adoptees and as the wonderful products of open adoption. And I think for a while, one of the main things I was kind of talking to my mom about before we hopped on the call was when you have a closed adoption, it seems like there's very much this fantasy world that you can create. And I feel like there's a term for it. I can't remember.
Oh, yeah. Ghost Kingdom.
Ghost Kingdom. So you have this like world where what if I had been with my birth parents? And like for better or for worse, there was no illusion there. I knew the what if.
The curtains could have been opened.
Yes, exactly. And my birth father had shared that before I was born, he was really on a bad path, potentially going to join a gang. Like it was just not, it was hard. And so I think in some ways that being lost is a good thing because I was able to appreciate what I had. But one of the things I'm still struggling with, and I think has contributed to some of the emotional turmoil in my life, is this adoptee's guilt and feeling like, oh my gosh, why did I get so lucky? Why was I given this opportunity that so many other people weren't? And just reconciling with now as I'm 25, going to turn 26 soon, starting to think about what I want for my life. And I think a part of where that adoptee's guilt came in is I was often looking to other people for validation of my choices and not wanting to ever disappoint my parents, even though I will say they always made me feel loved. But when you kind of carry that guilt of why me, it can be difficult. And so that was, I think, one thing that's pretty characteristic maybe of our open adoption is that we saw like what life could have been.
Yeah. So kind of survivor's guilt.
Yeah, exactly.
A little bit. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Linda, do you have any reflections on what Belle just talked about?
Well, yeah, I was thinking about, what are some of the challenges and what I saw. And I have to say that in writing the book, I learned so much more than I knew while Belle was growing up. So now I've got all this guilt about, oh gosh, I wish I had known this or I wish I had known that. But one of the things that I saw is Belle was the child that was always the pleaser and the perfectionist. And I think, now that I know about the primal wound and the vulnerability for that child, I think that trying to please and be perfect growing up, and I saw that in Belle. And I think that could have stemmed from the separation from her birth mom. Yeah. Although I will also mention this, that her birth parents took her into that room for 2 days and stayed with her. I think that gave Belle a tremendous maybe leg up on what a lot of adoptees have.
Healing.
Because Belle's sibling did not have that. And it wasn't because their birth mom didn't want to give it to them, but they had gone into the NICU. And then it turned out that they were still in the hospital and their birth mom went home. And so there was quite a separation. And I could actually see the difference.
Oh, interesting.
Just in how the babies reacted even to me and to us. But another thing that I saw later and recognized it not while it was happening, but I've learned that adoptees can also harbor anger and they don't know where it came from. And Belle did have some times in her life, she's smiling, where this anger came out and it was not commensurate with the situation. Why should she be that angry?
Yeah.
And I think that all of those things, I didn't recognize it at the time, but I do think that it has to do its roots in the adoption and separation.
Yeah. And I mean, I've learned a lot more about adoption, and then also I am diagnosed ADHD. So I've learned a lot about ADHD as well, and like emotional dysregulation and that way too. And I think that it's kind of hard sometimes to unravel, like with the ways in which adoption affected me versus just other experiences in my life, like society, whatever, all these different things. Yeah. But I will say, like, playing the role of like kid who like always wants to make their parents happy. And my sibling we both were rebellious, but like my sibling was definitely more rebellious, and they were the older one. And I think I saw how hard it was for my parents as well. And so I think maybe some of the anger came from this repression of really knowing how to cope with this guilt and knowing how to cope with the loss, and also just kind of making sense of my birth parents' like different involvement in my life too, and like making sense of that.
I mean, between your birth mom and your birth dad?
Yes.
Okay. Because they did not stay together, right?
No, they didn't stay together. They married other people and had kids with other people. Yeah, I think sometimes it was like a little bit hard for me to understand too why I was seeing my birth father more than my birth mother. And I know a lot of that was financial as well. And my birth mother didn't have the same financial means that my birth father had. And I actually had a really cool conversation with my birth father. I think actually the same time I was back when I was going through the pictures, and with my birth father and his brother, who was also close with my birth mother. And we cried and we kind of talked about a lot of different things, and they shared insight like that about how it was difficult for them. And even when they knew the relationship was over, they had this tremendous trauma bond and how that affected them and as teenagers going into young adulthood.
Yes.
But I was able to get that perspective from my birth father too, to kind of shed light on some of the different things that I didn't always understand growing up.
Well, that's so beautiful that he was able to share that with you and that you can empathize with how tough that must have been for them.
Absolutely.
And you can empathize with your little infant child self that's like, dang it, what's going on? Where is everybody? And that ADHD is so common for adoptees and then anger too. And it's super common and it's totally understandable. Like you don't know what's going on. You don't know words. You don't understand what these grownups are doing around you. You're just like, what the heck? Where did my mom go? So I hear you have a lot of wisdom and a lot of insight into all those different angles and complexities. None of this is simple and just like, oh, it's all good or it's all bad. It's so complicated. And for 25, I give you lots of credit.
Me too.
I have a wonderful family and a sibling that is also going through it.
Yeah.
I think one of the greatest gifts that my parents gave my sibling and I was each other. And having, it's going to make me cry.
I know.
Having someone who, obviously we had different situations. We had different birth parents and we did have very different experiences, I think, with our birth parents as well. I don't want to gloss over that, but having a sibling that can understand the uniqueness of our situation. And I think my sibling did a lot of the work ahead of me.
That was nice of them.
I know, right? I remember when they were first kind of looking into the ways their adoption affected them, and they were reading The Primal Wound. And one of the things that they kind of shared was the loss that you have with your birth mother when you're separated at birth and how that can affect you, even if it's not something that you consciously remember. And I remember being maybe 16 or 17, and I resented that so much. And that was my adoptee's guilt kind of coming in, being like, how could we possibly say that we were just doomed from the start when we've been given so much and we've had such a good go? And I have always loved my sibling and been their biggest supporter, but that really was hard for me to understand and hard for me to understand why they were giving thought to that. And I didn't believe it at first. And I think I still have a lot of work to do, but I'm grateful that they had the insight and were able to share that with me. And
it's something that each of you individually and together will probably work on the rest of your life, kind of just hashing it out, figuring it out, how it affects everybody. How is the book, the memoir that your mom wrote, how was it writing that as a family? Belle, Linda, how has it brought you closer? Did you get in fights over it? Or has it been wonderful?
So one, I learned so much about my adoption and the adoption process, like how many hoops my parents had to go through. And I was able to see photographs and letters and stuff from when I was first adopted and my parents' picture in their little book that all the birth parents would look through, and they were, selling themselves.
Little advertisement book. I know. It's so awkward.
Yes. But I think in some ways it was challenging, but overall I felt I think it was probably harder for the birth mothers than it was for Sexton or I, just because my mom writing this book, it kind of brings to the surface some things that maybe they haven't even touched for a long time. My mom had us read all the chapters. We got a copy of the book before we went to the editor. We got many copies that were very nicely binded. Thanks, Mom. And I checked off on all the parts about my childhood. And there's a line that always makes me laugh, Belle was not without her struggles with drugs and alcohol. And I remember reading that and I was like, you're right, but
do you really have to put it in the book?
I was
Mom?
Put me on blast, Mom. But I think overall, my sibling and I are very authentic people. And maybe because of our open adoption and just because of the way that our parents taught us to share it, I feel like we were a lot more confident in talking about these things. A lot of times my fun fact, when you're in a big group of people and they're like, what's your fun fact? Mine would be I'm adopted. Right. And I would share that. So I think overall it wasn't too hard, but I think it was definitely difficult. And Mom, you can probably speak to it more, but.
Yeah, the book, it did take me about 5 years to really do it from start to finish. And as I said before, I learned so much in writing this book because I had to do research and, I had many aha moments. But I think the most important parts of that book are the chapter where I interviewed my 2 kids. So their voices are in there. But also there is some writing in there from Belle's birth father and a couple of places where he wrote, and that's in there. And then also Belle's older sibling's birth mom wrote a piece. And she really had a very difficult time when I gave her the book, because if you think about it, this made them relive this moment in their life that was incredibly difficult. So she had a hard time giving me feedback because I interviewed everybody for the book. I interviewed all 4 birth parents as well as my 2 kids. And so I wanted to get their voices, their perspective. And after I did that, and she read it, she said, I need to write something myself, and did. And it's a beautiful piece that she wrote, which is in there. And then Belle's birth grandmother wrote a piece as well. So I feel like even though I'm the author of the book, I worked as hard as I could to get everybody's perspective and everybody's voice in there. And I think that's what makes it so special.
That is really special. Yeah, it's one thing for an adoptive mom to say, open adoption is so great. But to hear from all the players all the way around. And I love that the grandma's in there, or the grandparent. That's so beautiful. Is there anything else that you would like to say that I didn't ask about? Is there anything you'd like to say as we close?
I think my mom does a great job addressing this in the book, but open adoption is not without its challenges. There's certainly benefits of having double the family, but it comes with sometimes double the complications and double the relationships to maintain and navigate. But I truly think that we were given such a gift in being able to get to know our birth parents. And I wrestle with that all the time. Why was I so lucky? But I would say, I guess, just to hopeful adoptive parents consider that. Even though it might be messy, it might be hard sometimes, you might have different opinions, and it's kind of hard to, I think, imagine raising a child with another set of opinions. But I think for the sake of the child, it's definitely to their benefit. And just love your kid and let them be who they're going to be. I think that's good advice for anyone.
Nice. That is great advice. Linda, what would you like your last words to be?
Yeah, I would say if there's only one thing that I could say, it would be that an adopted child benefits greatly from knowing and connecting with their biological family. And if you can do it directly with the birth parents, that's great. But even if you can't, there's somebody in their family, whether it's a grandmother, a grandfather, an aunt, an uncle, a brother or sister, there's somebody that you as an adoptive parent can connect with and connect your child to them, because, we're nature and nurture. Yeah. And, the adoptive parents can do all the nurturing they want and can, and they can do a perfect job at that. Well, they can't. Nobody does a perfect job. But the fact is that nature comes from their biological family, and they need to know about that. And if they have no clue about that, it's a huge void. So, the child is the North Star in any adoption, and connect them with their birth families, however you can do that, when it's possible, if it's at all possible.
I think that's great advice. Well, thank you both. This is our first mother-daughter episode. It's great having you guys' energy here. Is there a way people can get a hold of either of you, or do you want just to Linda, or if people wanted to say hi, what would you like?
I will let my mom plug her socials, and then maybe if someone does want to get a hold of me, then my mom can send me the message.
Gotcha.
Yes, I'll do that. And look, the best way to get hold of me is through my website. It's lindarSexton.com. And if you go to that website, I have, obviously, my book is up there, and you can buy my book from there. But more importantly, I've got blogs. I tell little stories in blogs, and I will give you the 10 things I wish I knew at the start of my journey, and just connect. We're doing this to help people coming after us. That's our whole purpose.
Yep.
So lindarSexton.com.
Great. And I'll put that in the show notes in case you're driving or something as you're listening to this. And I'm with you, Linda. I'm trying to help people know better better than I did when I went through it. So if anyone's listening that knows younger adoptive parents that have little kids or that are thinking about adopting, share this episode with them, get them more educated than I was for sure. And just help them to learn from those of us that have been through it, and especially learn from adoptees like Belle that are willing to share their story. That's awesome. Thank you both for being on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beth.
Now, listeners, after you go check out Linda's website, go and check out unravelingadoption.com. There's lots of information on there and resources, including information about our book, coaching, events. We have a couple of great events coming up on Sunday, October 13th. We have our next Conversations about Adoption and Suicidality. It's a discussion circle based on our brand new book called Adoption and Suicidality. It's a place for people to come and talk openly about their experiences with suicide or suicidality. And the next week, October 20th, we have another medicine circle with Miyoke Ikaro for adoptees who have been transformed through plant medicine. Lots of really great resources for you galore. So check out unravelingadoption.com. Thank you all for listening. Belle, Linda, and I want you all to stay safe.